What do we know about theater, the most ephemeral of the arts, in Ukraine? What role did Ukrainian theater play in Soviet times? How is the heritage of the executed Renaissance generation still alive today? And why are women in theater so important and yet so often ignored? You're listening to the Explaining Ukraine podcast. Explaining Ukraine is produced by UkraineWorld, an English-language media project about Ukraine run by Internews Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I'm a Ukrainian philosopher, editor-in-chief of UkraineWorld and president of PEN Ukraine. The host of this episode is Tetyana Ogarkova, a Ukrainian literary scholar at Kyiv Mohyla Academy and journalist at Ukraine Crisis Media Center. She also runs a French-language podcast, L'Ukraine face à la guerre, Ukraine Facing the War. Our guest today is Mayhill Fowler, historian and associate professor in the Department of History at Stetson University. Her first book, Beau Monde on Empire's Age, State and Stage in the Soviet Ukraine, tells the story of how theater in Soviet Ukraine was formed through a collective biography of young artists and officials in the 1920s and 1930s. This episode is produced in partnership with the Kyiv Mohyla Academy and the project Heritage Ukraine, supported by the European Union's Erasmus program. I want to thank the Ukrainian History Global Initiative for helping organize this conversation. Before we begin, a quick reminder, you can support our work on Patreon. Your contributions are vital. We rely heavily on crowdfunding. You can also help fund our volunteer trips to frontline areas of Ukraine, where we support both civilians and soldiers. You'll find all the relevant links in the episode description. So let's begin.
So, Mayhill, first of all, thanks a lot for accepting to talk about what you do and what you write. We know you as a professor of history at Stetson University in Florida. We talk in Kyiv because you're here for a conference. We also know you as an author of this great book about theater in Soviet times, Ukrainian theater in Soviet times, Beau Monde on Empire's Age, State and Stage in Soviet Ukraine. It was published in 2017 in English, and it was recently translated into Ukrainian language and published at Rodovit Publishing House at 2025. So your primary interest is theater. So you know a lot about theater in Soviet times and specifically about Ukrainian theater. And there's a subject we'll discuss today in our series of podcasts about Ukrainian heritage. So this is a series of podcasts about Ukrainian heritage. And when you think about theater, this is something like, you cannot touch when it happened many decades ago, right? So this maybe is the major problem when you write about theater back in 20s and 30s. You wrote a lot about Kurbas, about Kulish, about all things we admire today, but we cannot see them because they're no more here. So what can be told about this Beau Monde, about this Ukrainian stage during Ukrainian Renaissance in the 20s and later on?
Okay, that's a huge question. There's so much to say. I'm so happy to be on this podcast. I'm a big fan of UkraineWorld. I listen to it all the time, actually when I go jogging. So one podcast is one jog. So I'm a big fan. It's great to be invited. So that's a big question. So first of all, yes, one of the challenges of studying theater is that it is an ephemeral art. And you can read reviews, you can look at photographs, but unless you time traveled back to sitting in that audience or lurking backstage, you never really know what that experience was like. It's one of the challenges of studying theater. And I think theater also, the same play performed in different places at different times means something completely different, right? So Shakespeare performed at the Globe Theatre in the 16th century meant something very different than performed today, right? And capturing that can be very difficult. So I'll just give a quick example of that. There was an exhibit, maybe you saw Kurbas Novi Sviti, Kurbas New Worlds, right, at Mistecki Arsenal in 2018, I believe.
It was before the big war.
Yes, exactly. And I I gave a presentation there. Svetlana Tkach very kindly invited me to come, and they had found the notes, the score to Alo Nachvili Chotiri Simsim, which is from 1929, the first ever real Ukrainian musical. Mm-hmm. And she invited a musician to play that piece. And I'd written about this show. I had it in my head. I'd seen pictures. I sort of thought I knew how it sounded. And they played this sort of, I think, the first big orchestra piece from this show from 1929 in Arsenal, in this evening with this, Ukrainian orchestra. And it sounded so different than I thought. And I was stunned. I was like, this is not at all how I imagined this. Yeah. But it was a beautiful moment, because you realize you can't ever grasp the reality of a show from the 1920s, right? Yeah. You can try, you use your imagination, you use your research, but there's always something a bit beyond your grasp. And I think that that's one of the beautiful mysteries about studying theater.
Yeah.
So about the book, so I actually use this concept, Beau Monde, which can confuse people, because people think of Beau Monde as like artsy artists sitting around drinking wine,
something happening,
smoking, right, having affairs, whatever. But actually, it's a term that has that several scholars have written about, and that actually means sort of movers, shakers, like the people who are maybe not just artists, but they might be important people or philanthropists or mecenate, right, patrons. In my book, a lot of officials. So it's sort of the insiders, right? A group of insiders who might be artists, who might be officials, who might be audience members, but they're the people kind of making this culture, whether it's by funding it or promoting it or censoring it, right, or denouncing it, right? They're the people making this culture. And I use that term because maybe as a former actress myself, I felt frustrated by what I thought was very much a dichotomy between like artists and the state. Like artists always had to be like opposing the state, or they were collaborating with the state. And I felt like, the reality of being an artist is you have to dance with power, right? And you work in structures. And you might be frustrated by the structures, or you might oppose the structures, or you might support the structure. But like you work within this world. And I, as someone who had been in theater in the United States, I was really interested in, well, what was it like to be in that world in this time that to me was very far away in time and space. And so this Beau Monde, it kind of, to me, it sort of captured, that intertwining of artists and officials that I think is very specific to the Soviet context, and kind of helps us maybe move beyond that sort of artist-official dichotomy and maybe ask more interesting questions and really sort of think about what was it to make theater in this regime, right, in this time. Yeah, and also I think for me, what was really interesting and what is really interesting about theater in Ukraine now and then, and this has always been true, is that it's extremely diverse. And the 1920s and the 1930s are so incredibly interesting because, yes, you see Ukrainian language theater, you also see Yiddish language theater. I mean, this is one of the heartlands of Yiddish language theater. There's actually a Polish theater, the only one in the entire Soviet Union, in Kyiv. Of course, Russian language theater. There's also like German language theater. There's a Bulgarian theater at someplace, right? So it's this incredibly rich tapestry of artists making work that, to me, were all part of this Soviet Ukrainian culture, right? And I wanted to capture that diversity, right? That we have a tendency to say like, oh, this is the story of Yiddish language theater, and this is Ukrainian language theater. But actually, it's all part of this region. All the artists knew each other, right? You have designers designing for all these different theaters. So I really wanted to recapture that richness of the stage.
Yeah, they were
at this time.
Extremely rich years, extremely intense years.
Yes.
But if I ask you, when you write about Soviet Ukrainian theater,
Yeah.
is it more Soviet or more Ukrainian for you? You mentioned English,
Yeah.
you mentioned Polish.
Yeah.
And this is fundamental question to understand what was happening in this territory, because we are talking about heritage. To which extent we Ukrainians can claim this theater to be our heritage or not? Because we do know all the disaster which came after. I mean, this executed Renaissance, and we do know how Kurbas ended, and many other people, unfortunately.
Yeah. So I think that's a great question. I think, in a way, like the French would say, it's a question mal posée. It's a question that we could actually phrase, I think, more effectively, differently. And it's a question with which I've struggled, actually, since 2022. And in fact, I said this when I did some book presentations this summer, that when I was working on the translation of this book, Yaroslava Stricha, who's a brilliant translator, had already done the translation. We'd sort of, been working on it. I'd written a foreword in January 2022.
Mm-hmm. Just before the full-scale invasion.
And the full-scale invasion happened, and I said, we can't do this project. Because it's about one of the arguments in my book is that they were Soviet people. And I just felt like the heritage of the Soviet Union is so violent, and there's such a continuity between the Soviet Union and the Russian Federation today. How could I possibly be talking about, Kulish and Kurbas as that's just too provocative, isn't it? It's too painful. But then time moved on, and my Ukrainian colleagues felt like, no, actually, this is a very important story to be telling. And I, too, felt like this question of what to do with the Soviet past is very aktualny. It's very relevant right now. And as someone who has studied these people very intensely and kind of, they've occupied too much space in my brain for too long, I think I see their struggles, I see their complexity in a way that I hope is maybe useful to young artists working in Ukraine today who are struggling with, what do we do with this Soviet heritage, right? And I've been playing with this idea that, the question of was it Soviet, was it Ukrainian? Well, it was Soviet Ukrainian. Ukraine, this region, went through a Soviet period. And one that actually led to a lot of really great art and a lot of violence and tragedy. And I think there's a benefit to getting beyond that. Is it like beyond the Soviet versus Ukrainian and saying, okay, this place had a Soviet period. What was it to be an artist at this time? What did art mean? And what can we now take from that? And I think you can take a lot. I think that so many of these artists, not all of them, but so many of them believed in art so profoundly. I mean, they really believed art could change the world. They really did. They really believed that theater was going to make the world a better place,
yes.
which to me now might seem a little bit utopian, but they really believed it. And they really believed that, for those of them who had lived through the war and the revolution and the early Soviet, they thought they were building a better society, right? I mean, the Russian Empire, many problems there, right? They thought they were building a better world, and they had such hope and such, they worked so hard.
And they were so talented.
And they were, so talented. And I think that there's a lot to be taken from that. And for example, I'll give one example, which is, it's finally occurred to me, Berezil is a post-war story. They all lived through the war.
First World War.
Yeah. And what's very different, I think, about the Ukrainian avant-garde and, say, the avant-garde in Russia is that everyone in the Ukrainian avant-garde lived through war in a bodily way, right? I mean, they were in Kyiv when the armies are changing, or when there's a actually strikes happening in the city during the first Bolshevik occupation. They're out in the countryside trying to perform when armies are like going back and forth. They experience violence and war in a way that a lot of artists elsewhere didn't. And honestly, when you look at what they were doing from 1917 to 1922, it's kind of amazing they survived, right? But they did. But they survived this incredible experience, right? And then they made Brazil. And then they made avant-garde theater. And then they rethought what theater could do. But it came from that experience of war, which for them was very direct. And I think there's something to take from that for young artists today. I do. You're living through a war. What are the stories you're going to tell after war? You're just like Kurbas and Kulish and Ostavishnya. You're just like these people who lived through this incredible, painful, difficult time, and then they made these stories and they rethought theater and they were doing these crazy things. I think that is something very resonant with today, right? And I think when we kind of, again, move beyond the like, is it Soviet, is it Ukrainian, what do we do with the Soviet past, but really look at these as people living through crisis, living through war, and they made this stuff. I think that's something that I hope artists in Ukraine can really hold on to.
Yeah. And by the way, when we talk about these years, if you talk about this year, the first Ukrainian independence, so 2022. So Soviet is early Soviet.
Yeah,
so Soviet
exactly.
Definitely Soviet is after in 20s. So
Yeah.
and if you highlight this dimension of the war, in a way we do hope that this war will end in a different way.
Yes, absolutely.
From
Yes,
this war,
yes.
but you're right. The Cuba started then back in West and Kyiv, and then only then Brazil moved to Kharkiv.
Exactly.
So this is very dramatic experience and very enriched experience, because we do know, by the way, Kurbas brought a lot from Vienna and from European theaters.
Yeah, he did. So he, it's actually very interesting, I think. Again, one thing that is specific about theater in Ukraine is it really is a mix of these different influences. And I think one thing that made Berezil so special was you had these two big streams coming together. I mean, and one was the provincial Russian imperial theater, right? And you have a lot of these actors kind of coming from that tradition, and the Lysenko school here, you know. But then you have not only Kurbas, right, but a bunch of artists coming from a very different tradition, a tradition of itinerant Ukrainian language theater, and a tradition of, you know, certainly for Kurbas, like he studied in Vienna, so he saw this German expressionism. He saw a very, very refined, theater in Vienna. He was in Lemberg, Lviv, right, and saw Pawlikowski and sort of saw a lot of the Polish modernism, Moda Polska there. And he's bringing this, you know, he didn't know anything about Imperial Russian theater. Why would he, right? So he's bringing this different tradition. So you have these like two like streams coming together. And I think there's always something, when you have two streams coming together, you know what? It's going to be interesting.
Exactly.
Right. And I think that's what made Berezil so interesting, is that you have these different experiences and again, different artistic traditions and genealogies making something new.
Yeah. And in Brazil, there was also Vadim Meller, this famous painter who also had this heritage, I mean, this European heritage of, I don't know, Cubism or whatever in this sense. So it was different. It was not Russian imperialist theater for sure. And then you had Kulish. You studied a lot.
Yeah.
This completely different guy.
Completely different.
He had different roots and different... different culture in a way.
Yeah.
Somebody from Kherson
region,
which is actually, unfortunately, partly occupied by Russians, but is extremely poor. When I read his text about Golod, about famine, this is it was 2021, right?
Yeah, no, he's writing about his home, which is Khersonshina, it's southern Ukraine. The town where he grew up, Oleshki, is now under occupation. A lot of where he grew up is under occupation. And Oleshki was actually flooded when the Kakhovka Dam
It was exploded by Russian army.
Yeah, so it's sort of puts his story it adds a different light to his story, right? When we think of that. But yeah, I mean, he came from nothing, very poor.
Probably zero lines.
Zero. Super smart, worked his way up, wrote his way up, and telling stories that I think came from him, like really his place, where he's from, and I think even though they're 100 years old, I think they can read as very fresh today.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, because all of details are important, starting from what's happening in Kherson region, and this mix of Kulish and Kurbas, and then Kyiv and Kharkiv,
Yeah.
So closer they moved the theater closer to the Russian border because of this idea. When we talk about theater as a heritage, so you mentioned that for us it's a heritage because we also live in this kind of context, war context, and we feel close, all these people. So we have 100 years apart, almost 100 years apart from this theater. But what are, according to you, other explanations? Because we've seen this popularity of Kurba theater, I would say, years before the full-scale invasion started. I remember Ukrainian theaters trying to explore this theater, to try to make reference to Kurbas, Berezil, many years before the war started. How can you explain this history in theater? When you studied for many years, how do you explain in this very the art you cannot touch? How do you explain this history and this heritage in theater?
Okay, so that's a very complicated question. So
I know.
Okay, so no one could say anything about Kurbas, could even mention his name until the 1960s, right? Okay, but then people could, and I think. And Kulish starts to be staged a lot again in the 1960s. There's sort of a return to Kulish and a return to Kurbat. Like, let's talk about them, right? Mm-hmm. People were still alive who knew them, right? And people were deeply interested in bringing them back, right? So, Vasil Vasilko, famously, who was one of his former students, got everyone to write spochade, memoirs, right, and put together sort of this first compilation of memoirs about him. And one particularity of the Soviet Union in general is that there was these theater institutes, there's a teatroznavstvo institutionalized. We don't really have that in the U.S., right? So there sort of was this institutional base for kurbasoznavstvo, right? We're studying Kurbas in the context of this theater, right? But I think that rigid institutionality maybe made it difficult to ask different questions or consider Kurbas a real person. He becomes this sort of distant hero, martyr, right? Who it's actually very hard to talk to, and in a weird way hard to get inspiration from because he seems so beyond you. And I think it's really taken a long time for people to kind of bring him off the pedestal. And the only way, I think, the only way he can really inspire is when he's off the pedestal and you can sit down and have a conversation with him. And, so Alexander Savchuk, right, republished, right, Filosofia Teatru.
This huge book.
That's really amazing and everyone should buy. And Mykola Naboka, who is trained in Jacques Lecoq in Paris and a student at LNU and now has this Studio Chvilia and, does all this work. And he sort of spearheaded publishing Stepan Bondarchuk's kind of primer on Kurbas technique called Mimogramata. And he was telling me this summer that he and his studio, they did all those exercises. They did Mimogram,
did what Kurbas told.
Did what Kurbas said. And he said, some of it was cool and some of it was
stupid.
No, maybe that worked 100 years ago, but it doesn't work now, right? And so they were actually in dialogue with it. Mm-hmm. And I think what's so important is to have dialogue, and dialogue with Kurbas. And I think that...
Practice Kurbas.
Yes.
Or don't.
Yeah. And I think, what's hard about Spadshina and legacy and heritage is to get in dialogue with it, right? And to say, Kurbas can give us so much. He's also of his time. And maybe there's some things we do differently now. Mm-hmm. And maybe we tell stories in different ways. But there's still so much we can get from him. And I think that's the challenge, right? I think, you know more than I do, right? But one of the things about heritage in the Soviet period is it's kind of rigid and, there's our heroes and our martyrs and this and this. And now I think, there needs to be more dialogue and dynamism.
Yeah, sure.
And I think that is happening with Kurbas, which is great, right? And I think one of the really important questions that I try to get students to think about is, he really was of his time, and he did actually mentor and support women, some of the women who were in his studios, but we don't talk about them a lot, right? And we should, right? So I think Kurbas's novel tends to be very Kurbas focused, and we need to widen that and think about, okay, who were all the women around here making this possible, right? And think about sort of Berezil as a company and a process and a concept, right? I mean, one of the cool things I think about Berezil and about Kurbas is that it was multiple studios. It was a big training program. It was about community. He did raise the next generation. Mm-hmm. It wasn't just him.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, for many people, many women.
Yeah.
And talking about women, so you're actually writing another book about women in theatre. So let us, it is still not published, and would you please mention maybe the title, provisional title, and tell us a little bit more about Ukrainian women in this theatre, so this is about Ukrainian theatre, about why women were important, and what are you talking about in your book?
Okay, awesome. It's called Theatre Women. I hope to finish it soon. It is not yet fully finished, but I've been working on it for many years, precisely because I finally started realizing one of the problems of my first book is that there weren't a lot of women in it.
There were Kulish,
there's Kulish, Kurbas, Vishya, where are the women?
All men.
Where are the women? And that is a feature of a lot of the work on the Rozstrelenie Vidrodzenia, on the executed Renaissance. There's a lot of men there. It's a very male world, right? And yet there were women there. And so, and in gender history, one of the premises is that we shouldn't just, find the women, right? But when you add women to the picture, you see a different picture, right? And so here's a very simple example. In one of my chapters, I actually look at the 1920s and the avant-garde theater movement, which is amazing. And Kurbas is amazing. It's not that he's not. It's not that there's not a ton of cool stuff happening in theater. But when you look at women, you see something a little different. They're not writing manifestos. They're largely not directing these productions we study now. But they have a lot to do. A lot of the new theater institutes, a lot of puppet theaters, theaters for children are all run by women. Mm-hmm. And actually what you see is what I'm calling a professional revolution. So you have an aesthetic revolution, sure, but you also have this really weird phenomenon of, because there's all these new state-managed and funded institutions, women can have these jobs, and they suddenly start working professionally in theater in a way that they didn't before. And once you start noticing it, it's really noticeable that women are involved professionally in a way that they weren't before. So it's an example of, it's not just about where were these women, it's about looking at when we find them and we sort of see a gender picture and a gender landscape, we might think about the avant-garde in a different way.
Yeah,
right.
For sure. But if you talk about women in Ukrainian theater, there are some women way before this avant-garde
Oh, yeah.
right? So you start your book with...
I started with Zankovecka. I started with Zankovecka, who is like, we all love Zankovecka, right? But I think one thing that's so interesting about her, and other people have written about this for sure, but, she was amazing. She was also really a businesswoman, right? And someone who, when we really think about it, like, to leave your family and your husband to, like, go and perform, that is radical, right? And so we think of her as this sort of lovelorn, oh my God, Sadovsky, heroine of Ukrainian culture. But actually she was fierce. She was she was demanding like better money, conditions. She knew she was the star, right? She knew people were coming to see her, And so I think kind of what my book, this chapter about Zankovecka wants to do is restore some of that kind of business savvy to her, right? Which you had to, if you were a woman in 19th century theater, you had to be that way, right?
Because otherwise there were no model for you, no place for you.
No place for you, no place for you. And there was no place for you in society, right? You were sort of an outsider immediately. Men weren't, but women were, right? You stepped on the stage, you were an outsider, and you really had to fend for yourself. And she does, and she's brilliant. So I'm starting with Zankovecka, moving through this period of the avant-garde. I have a chapter about a really amazing actress, Hanna Babiivna, who was a Berezil actress, and she actually was in the Gulag for 5 years.
Okay.
And I met her granddaughter many years ago, Zoriana Ivashchenko, who let me read her mom's memoirs about her mom, about Hanna Babiivna, that were revelatory about, you can read my book, but about sort of this everyday life of a Soviet Ukrainian actress and her experience and her incredible survival across this long 20th century. And sort of thinking about her story, I think makes us realize that so much of our idea about Ukrainian theater is these guys who were murdered in the 30s, and actually there's a long, rich history to Ukrainian theater in the 20th century, and a lot of that is carried by women, and so I think there's something about focusing on them that can maybe help us see the longue durée of theater here. I have some Yiddish theater actresses in my book as well, which is, again, such an important story. I tell the story of Dina Pronicheva, who was a Holocaust survivor in Babin Yar, and then she played the role of a Ukrainian actress, Nadia Savchenko, actually, under Nazi occupation. Like, literally, Nazis in the audience, and she's on stage performing. It's like unbelievable, right? So she's in the book. And some Yiddish theater artists who spent the war in evacuation. Many of their families were murdered here during World War II, and then they came back and had to survive their theater, Yiddish theater being shut down, and sort of how they then worked in Ukrainian theater, worked in Russian theater. But I think that experience also really shaped post-war theater in Ukraine. So there's a lot of women in the book, and it ends with women today. And I think that the shifting gender dynamics in Ukrainian theater today is something that I'm following, and something that I think hopefully eventually we'll have a lot of scholarship about, because I think that things are changing. I think that women are doing amazing work, and I think that that's something to pay attention to.
Yeah. And as you said, this kind of dialogue between the present and the past.
Yeah.
So this is important. This is what makes this heritage be kind of living thing.
Yes, exactly.
You can talk with them. You can argue with them.
Yeah.
You can ignore them sometimes.
Yeah.
You can say they were stupid or they were whatever you like, but the tradition is alive when you consider them as being something, being a part of you. Even the part if you might reject sometimes and say, I don't accept all this. Do you talk about Natalia Ujvi?
I do, actually. Yes, I do. And I'm actually struggling a bit with that chapter. So if you have any ideas, I'd love to hear them. But she's so interesting, and she right after, of course, she sort of skyrockets to fame during the war because of Raduga, right? Which is shown throughout much of the world, actually. And she becomes the deputy head of the Ukrainian Theater Artists Union after the war. And it's interesting, she's the one who gets all the letters from people saying, I need help. My husband was killed, I need better housing, or whatever. Like, she's getting all of these letters, and the way that people write to her is like, Pani Natalyu, you are such a wonderful actress. You must be a great person. You must be a kind person. Therefore, you will help me. Which is very, very interesting. And she actually spearheads creating the sort of the home for retired actors in 1959 in Pushavoditsa. That's really her initiative. But she's a very complicated person. And there's a lot of, criticism of her for the way that she acted in the 1930s and some of the choices that she made.
Some people thought she was even denouncing her friends to the...
Yeah, some people thought that, it's interesting.
At least there were rumors about it.
These were rumors. I mean, I read Semenko's file, and a lot of people wrote a lot of things about Semenko, but they never even, at least in the file, they never thought to interview her, right? I mean, there's a lot of people saying a lot of stuff about Semenko, but she didn't. And again, not that I don't know. I don't know the full story. We'll never know the full story. But what I think is interesting is that many people fixate on that. Mm-hmm. And there's a term by Jonas Barish, the anti-theatrical prejudice, that people involved in theater must be whores. They must be bad. And there's a lot of the language about Ujvi really reflects that, right? Oh, she was an actress. She must have done something bad. Whether she did or not, I don't know. A lot of people made questionable choices in the 1930s. We might have too. But it's interesting that people fixate on her in a way that they don't fixate on other people, right? And there's absolutely a gender component to that. So she's in my post-war chapter as someone who becomes sort of more than an actress, right? I mean, she's really involved in this like civic organization of resetting things up after the war, and her work kind of ceases to be as important as her work on the stage ceases to be as important as her work in society. And she's a very polarizing figure.
She died when she moved to Moscow. Am I mistaken?
No, she didn't move to Moscow. She died here. She died here. Yeah, in Kyiv. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And there is a street named after her name, Natalia Ujvi, in Kharkiv, in Saltivka.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, very well-known street because it was all destroyed by Russian artillery, and the most destructions were on these streets. So, and each time you pass now, you think about this beautiful woman who's married to Semenko.
Yeah.
You know, all these Beau Monde, as you say, in your book, and who was a so beautiful actress.
Yeah.
Such a long and complicated life.
A long and complicated life, and very much reflective of the times in which she lived, right?
Mm-hmm. And maybe the last question to you would be about the present time.
Yeah.
You love Ukrainian theater.
I do.
You try to see as many places as you can, and we talk about heritage here, but nevertheless, I want to ask you this question. What we've noticed, being all the time here in Ukraine, we've noticed that there are at least two things in this contemporary culture which are extremely important. This is, first of all, poetry. We've never had such kind of new poets at the same time. And another thing is theater. We never had such problems to get any kind of tickets to theater as starting from 2022. I don't know why, but it's a huge problem to get tickets to theater because a lot of people go to theater. Yeah. So my question to you is about what do you like about Ukrainian theater today?
Oh my God, that's such a great question. So yes, I love Ukrainian theater today, and I know from my colleagues I have colleagues in Ukrainian theater who criticize this and criticize that. they're absolutely right. Of course, I respect them, absolutely. But a thing about me is I will see anything in Ukraine. I don't even care what's being performed. I just love sitting in theaters in Ukraine.
At
any time, because in general, and yes, I know there's exceptions, theater means something different here than at home. So there's still, I think, an idea that theater is something you go to in Ukraine. And like in the United States, theater is really expensive. It's kind of weird and elite. And it's not normal to go to the theater in the United States. Again, I'm generalizing hugely, right? I took my partner to see a play on Broadway in May, and it took half my salary. You know what I mean? So theater's more an everyday part of life here, which means that theater then can be much more a space for reflection on what is happening in society, right? It's not something removed, kind of. It's something that is much more reflective of what's happening right now in state and society. And you really kind of get a sense of that. So I love, when I go to theater in Ukraine, I love watching the audience. I love watching who's there. Is it the hipsters we see going to Tetyana C in Lviv? Is it maybe more of the pensioners we might see at other theaters, right? Who is there? How are they dressed? How are they responding? How are they reacting? It just immediately, you want to learn about Ukraine, go to the theater, right? The way that people respond to shows, sometimes if I think something's really boring, and I kind of maybe don't understand all the jokes, and I'm so confused, but then watching people in the audience love it, I'm okay, this is fascinating, right? This is so cool. I saw a show at the Teatr Kurbasa, the Kurbas Theater this summer in Lviv, and it was a staged version of Amanda Gorman's poetry, Tsina Svitla. And I know Amanda Gorman. I mean, I love her. To me, she's the most American of American poets, But then it was, Ukrainian actors performing Amanda Gorman's poetry, and it was beautiful. It was so unexpected and weird, and the way that people were responding to things that I wasn't responding to, and I was responding to lines that other people weren't responding to. And it was so profoundly interesting and beautiful. And I felt like I learned something about Ukraine in that evening in the theater. And so, and I think there's also something very powerful about sitting in a room with people and breathing together in extreme times. And even as an outsider, I can appreciate what it is to sit in a room and breathe with people in extreme times. And I think there's a specialness. I've always believed in the magic of theater. I've always believed that there is something about a story told live now from me to you, whether it's avant-garde or bourgeois, whatever. There's something about theater, and I think you feel it. You do feel it intensely here. And that is, it reminds you of the power of theater.
Yeah, because during the war, every moment is precious.
Every moment is,
and
yes.
Every moment of being together
is precious.
It's now or never. So people live today. That's why people like going to theaters. They understand the importance of presence, of being together, breathing together, sitting together, doing something together. So
yeah.
Thank you very much, Mayhill, for this dialogue, for your explanation, and for sure for your books. And we are eager to read your second book about the role of women in the Ukrainian theater. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
This was Explain Ukraine, a podcast produced by UkraineWorld, an English language media project about Ukraine run by Internews Ukraine. The host of this episode was Tetyana Ogarkova, a Ukrainian literary scholar at Kyiv Mohyla Academy and journalist at Ukraine Crisis Media Center. Our guest today was Mayhill Fowler, historian and associate professor in the Department of History at Stetson University. This episode is produced in partnership with the Kyiv Mohyla Academy and the project Heritage Ukraine, supported by the European Union's Erasmus program. I also want to thank the Ukrainian History Global Initiative for helping organize this conversation. A quick reminder, you can support our work on Patreon. Your contributions are vital. We rely heavily on crowdfunding. You can also help fund our volunteer trips to frontline areas in Ukraine, where we support both civilians and soldiers. You'll find all the relevant links in the episode description. Thank you for listening. Stay with us and stand with Ukraine.